I hope you all don't mind. I would like to record this just for my own personal record. But so hi everyone, my name is Sandra Sadek and I will be presenting my thesis, War in Yemen, Costs and Benefits to the United States. So just a little bit of background. I found this topic very relevant still nowadays, even though we don't see a lot of coverage in the media about the conflict, but that, just some facts to give you for this, as of 2018, there were 10,000 civilians that were killed in this conflict, and it is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world at the moment. So it is still very relevant, and the United States is very much involved in this. So just to break down how I'm going to explore this topic, I'm going to give you some background on the conflict. It is very complex. I will try to give you a quick crash course on, what has happened, how we got to where we are today, some of the external actors involved, including the United States, and then the benefits and costs of America being involved in this conflict. So some background on what the Yemen conflict is. So it actually began in 2011 during the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring were a series of protests across the Middle East in demand for, better economic opportunities, social opportunities, political opportunities, and a lot of places were successful with these protests. Other places, such as Yemen, were not. So the president at the time, President Saleh, did not like those protests. They quickly turned very violent with clashes between the military and the protestants. And then some outside entities, such as the GCC, became involved and proposed the Gulf Initiative, which stated that if Saleh stepped down, he would receive immunity and let his VP take over in a transitional government for 2 years. It took some time to get him on board with that. It even went up to the United Nations, but finally President Saleh agreed, signed the deal, and he resigned. His VP, Hadi, stepped in and took over in a transitional government for 2 years. However, that government was not very successful as well, and the Houthis staged a coup and took over the capital of Sana'a and dissolved the temporary parliament. But just some background on who the Houthis are. They are a Zaidi Shiite political and insurgent movement based in northern Yemen. And one of their biggest issue with the Yemeni government was that their leader at the time was a former parliament member, and he was killed in 2004 by the Yemeni government. And so ever since, they've had a lot of back and forth clashes between the Houthis and the government. So that's why they're, they don't get along very well. So then Hadi, which is the new president, right? He was vice president. He flees to Saudi Arabia and asks for help from his allies there. So Saudi Arabia puts together a coalition and invades Yemen and starts its airstrike bombing campaign. And that initial invasion is called Operation Decisive Storm. And that's kind of where we are at today. It's just been a back and forth between the Houthis and the coalition. There's been a lot of blockades, which has led to the hunger crisis that we have in Yemen today. The most recent peace talk was a truce in 2017, the Hodeidah truce. Hodeidah is one of the big ports in Yemen, which has, kind of helped with the conflict a little bit, but there's still lots of violence across the entire country. So that's my quick crash course on the background. There's a lot more elements to it, but I thought this would be a good overview of how we got to where we are today. So some external actors that we have, Saudi Arabia is of course a big one. They're leading the coalition that's bombing Yemen at the moment. So Saudi Arabia has a very complex history with Yemen. They share a border together, and this goes back to even when Saudi Arabia was becoming the nation that we know of it today. A lot of problems that have happened in Yemen has led to a lot of a big immigration population to come into Saudi Arabia, which has caused a lot of national security concerns for Saudi Arabia. So they have been very involved in Yemeni domestic affairs in the past, especially in governance along the shared border that they have. Another reason Saudi Arabia is very involved right now in the conflict is they believe the Houthis are backed by Iran. And as you know, Saudi Arabia and Iran are competing against one another right now to kind of dominate the Middle East. So as soon as, that's one of the things Saudi Arabia used to kind of get the coalition moving was the Houthis are backed by Iran. This is bigger than just Yemen. We need to intervene. So then we have Iran. So initially, Iran was not a huge supporter of the Houthis. There was never any huge concrete evidence that they were supporting Iran until Saudi Arabia became involved. And that makes sense. Again, Iran and Saudi Arabia are competing for hegemony in the region. So once Saudi Arabia became involved, Iran, for national security concerns, also increased in support starting in 2015. And a big reason also that they are involved is they're still trying to export those ideologies that came about during the 79 Islamic Revolution in Iran. So another big actor is the United States. So as I mentioned before, the US was a big supporter of the Gulf Initiative deal that was proposed in 2011 back during the Arab Spring. They also approved Operation Decisive Storm, which led the coalition to enter the Yemeni conflict. They gave that the green light, and that's how Saudi Arabia and the coalition started bombing Yemen. A lot of administrations, including the Obama administration, worked a lot with Saudi Arabia on counterterrorism in the area, especially in Yemen to fight AQAP, which is Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, and they have a big population in Yemen. They've also been trying to fight Iranian influence since '79, since the Islamic Revolution. Again, Saudi Arabia used that as a big tool to get other nations involved in the conflict. And then recently as well, there's been a lot of weapons deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia in the billions of dollars. So that's also been a big reason why the United States is involved in the conflict. So what does the US get from being involved in this conflict that seems, thousands of miles away? So again, it all comes down a little bit to money. The United States is one of the biggest exporters of weapons and arms in the world, and Saudi Arabia is its largest client. So a lot of those weapons that the United States are selling to Saudi Arabia are actually being used in the Yemen conflict, and I will get to that a little bit later and what that means for the United States. Another reason, again, also, we go back to Iran. Iran has always been a very big concern to the United States when it comes to national security and regional and global stability. So again, Saudi Arabia said the Houthis are backed by Iran, we have to intervene. So the US has become very, or they've been paying a lot of attention what the developments are in that country to kind of see, if Saudi Arabia, their ally, or Iran, the threat, is going to be coming out as the winner in this whole conflict. And then a third big benefit to the United States for them to be involved in this is to kind of ensure stability in the Middle East, especially when it comes to the petroleum reserves that are there. Although the United States is a big exporter of petroleum, they have their own reserves. The countries that are involved in the coalition, all of them are GCC countries, which are the big oil, all of them are oil-based countries, so they have a big reserve of petroleum. So the idea is that if the Yemeni conflict were to spill out of the borders and go to Saudi Arabia, for example, which is a big exporter of petroleum, it could have a rippling effect on the stability of the region and access to global petroleum resources. So it's also, again, has to do with money a little bit when it comes to stabilizing oil prices as well. So this all seems to be helpful to the United States, but it also could be costing them a lot. So the biggest cost to the United States would be potential human rights violation. So the United States claims that it is involved very indirectly in the Yemeni conflict. Most of it is just, providing weapons to Saudi Arabia, not necessarily to be used in Yemen, even though some of them are, and then just logistic and intelligence support. However, the actions of Saudi Arabia itself could be liable for human rights violation under the Rome Statute, which is, the statute that created the International Criminal Court. Again, the United States claims to be indirectly involved. However, there is also a statute that puts responsibility on states that aid or assist other states in the commission of internationally wrongful act, and that is the responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts in their Article 16, which I've posted there if you want to read it in its totality. So again, the United States is just providing weapons, but those weapons are being used on civilians in Yemen. You know, remnants of U.S. bombs and missiles have been found on sites. You know, it's written "Made in the USA," so there is a clear connection between U.S. and the Yemen conflict coming together in that instance. However, there is a catch-22. So the United States does not recognize the ICC and the treaty that creates the International Criminal Court. Therefore, if anybody were to actually bring up human rights violation charges against the United States, it would not be possible because, again, the U.S. has not signed the treaty and therefore does not recognize the court as a body. And, you know, they cannot be brought to justice in front of that court, which is, you know, the one that oversees these types of crimes and, you know, where the trials happen. So it is a kind of a catch-22. The United States knows that its weapons are being used against civilians, and the matter has been brought up many times, and they've always said, we are going to address it, and we're going to do better target location to avoid hitting civilian areas and hospitals and things like that, but that hasn't really happened, and we still see a lot of innocent people dying from the conflict. So there is, you know, kind of a loophole there where the U.S. is very much involved, but may not be held accountable for their actions. So I hope I gave you guys a good, quick crash course on what the Yemeni conflict. I thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, please fire away.
Fantastic job. So we have about 7 or 8 minutes for questions.
Let me see, should I start first? Sandra, what is the status of the war right now today, given this coronavirus, and where do we stand right now?
Well, right now, you know, there has been a couple ceasefires that have been signed to kind of, you know, shift our priority from just fighting the war to focusing on the coronavirus pandemic. There is major concern that if a COVID-19 pandemic were to reach Yemen, it would have devastating consequences, you know, beyond anything we've seen, just because, again, there are no hospitals there. The hygiene standards are very low. It is already a war-torn humanitarian crisis. And so if we add a pandemic over it, it could, you know, wipe out thousands of people. So right now, the biggest concern in Yemen is the pandemic, and there have been, again, a couple ceasefires that have been signed to kind of, you know, put a pause on that and focus on the other major issue, which is the pandemic we have at the moment.
I do not want to dominate the discussion, so let me leave the floor open to others, and then I'll come back and ask more questions. Professor Bishop, do you have your question, or should I ask your questions? Professor Bishop has sent me a number of questions to ask. She is in Algeria, and internet is not very good and sporadic. So if she cannot connect, I will ask her questions in her behalf. Dr. Bishop, can you hear us? Can you ask your own questions, or should I move on with your questions?
So she's been typing in the chat. She might be able to type her questions in the chat, or she said she sent some to you.
Okay.
Yeah. typed question number 1. Can you characterize the economy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and that of Yemen? Some simple index like GDP per capita?
So I don't have any GDP number off the top of my head, unfortunately, but I do know, so Yemen is one of the poorest country, is the poorest country in the Middle East and one of the poorest in the world. So their economy, I mean, there's not much going on for them. And Saudi Arabia has long relied on petroleum for their economy. However, in recent years, they have been trying to diverse their economy, you know, going on tourism and other means to provide for their economy other than petroleum if, you know, one day their reserve were to run out. So I hope that answers the question.
I should add that Saudi Arabia is one of the G20s. You can imagine what the economy they have as compared to poor Yemenis.
So then I think that did answer her question. The second one is, you mentioned that the Houthis are, as a Shiite population in Yemen, would you care to discuss Shiite populations in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia?
So Saudi Arabia is predominantly a Sunni country, so their Shiite population is very, very minor. However, the Houthis are, they're called Zaidi Shiite, so they're like a special branch within the Shiite branch of Islam. And from what I've read about it, because I was not familiar with the Zaidi Shiite branch, they're actually more closely related to the Sunni branch of Islam than the Shia Islam branch that we see, for example, in Iran. So when it comes to the whole idea of them being backed by Iran as a militia, some people say that that isn't necessarily true because the basis of their religion is more closely related to the Sunni branch of Islam that we see in Saudi Arabia than the Shiite one we see in Iran. And therefore, so the name of it is a little bit, throws you off a little bit because it does say Shiite. So you automatically think about the Iran branch, the one we see in Iran, but not necessarily because they're actually more closely related to the Sunni branch of Islam.
All right, we have maybe one more question and then we've got to move on. Does anybody else in the room have a question they want to ask? Okay, Michelle, do you want to finish out with number 3 and then we'll move on?
Yeah, so then Dr. Bishop also mentioned that she agrees with what you were saying. I think that everybody forgets that Yemen was the first post-colonial Arab state. And then her third question is, Robert Vitalis used to teach political science at the University of Texas. His work addresses the close relationship between the US and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, dating back to the founding of the kingdom, the 1930s. She might be typing the rest of that out. That wasn't a question.
Yeah, and we need to
wrap up, I guess.
We need to kind of wrap up, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the questions in the chat, so you can marinate in that, and you know, always feel free to keep having those conversations outside of this. But great job.
Yeah, fabulous job, Sandra.
Fantastic.
Great job, Sandra.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.